Hello, tonight. You find yourself standing at the edge of a world that feels older than memory itself, where rivers move like slow breathing beneath a pale, quiet sky. Something about this place seems to lower your thoughts without asking permission. And as you listen closely, you may begin to wonder whether history here was ever truly loud at all, or always this gently fading. You walk slowly across vast plains that stretch along the ancient flow of the Ganges basin, where morning mist lies like a soft blanket over endless soil. Geological studies confirm that these fertile sediments were formed over thousands of years through calm, repetitive river cycles. Everything feels suspended, as if even time prefers to take its steps carefully here rather than rush forward. The air carries a faint dampness from distant tributaries, and each breath you take feels evenly measured, almost like the land itself is regulating your pace. In this stillness, even the smallest sound feels oversized, like your thoughts accidentally turned the volume knob too high. You might even notice your imagination wandering, as if it forgot where it was supposed to go. So before you get completely comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what we're creating here. Now tell us in the comments where you are listening from, and what time it is in your part of the world. Now slowly dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan, letting the steady hum of the air fill the room. And in that gentle rhythm, we quietly step into tonight's journey together. You continue forward across terrain that once existed long before any kingdom claimed it, where ecosystems maintained their own balance without human guidance. Before dynasties and empires, this land functioned like a patient organism, adjusting itself through monsoon cycles and seasonal rhythm. It almost feels like nature was already rehearsing history, but without any need for an audience. The Indus and Ganges river systems are often studied in geology as long-term sedimentary architects, shaping one of the most fertile regions on Earth. Layers of alluvial soil reveal uninterrupted cycles of deposition, suggesting that life here was never interrupted by catastrophic ecological collapse. It is strangely calming to think that stability can exist for thousands of years without interruption. You notice small birds moving across the wet grass, leaving thin lines in the morning dew, as if drawing temporary maps no one will ever preserve. In a modern sense, it feels like nature is casually designing invisible UI elements for the landscape, which honestly would confuse any app developer. Even ancient land, it seems, enjoys subtle design patterns. Further ahead, scattered archaeological indicators suggest early human presence in nearby regions that would later become part of broader cultural networks. While full civilizations have not yet formed here in this moment of time, the land quietly prepares itself, as if waiting for human footsteps to arrive at exactly the right geological second. Wind moves through tall grass in slow waves, resembling the surface of a sleeping ocean that has forgotten it was ever water. Climate models reconstructing ancient South Asia describe a monsoon system that remained remarkably consistent over long periods. This predictability allowed ecosystems to stabilize in ways that feel almost mathematical in their repetition. You pause near a shallow bend in the river, noticing how reflections distort gently, like reality itself is breathing through glass. Everything appears slightly softened at the edges, as if the world prefers low resolution here, saving processing power for something more important. Even your thoughts begin to adopt that same softened quality. The soil beneath your feet contains mineral traces carried from Himalayan erosion, slowly delivered over countless seasons. Geologists often describe this as a living archive, where each layer is a quiet sentence written by water. It is oddly comforting to imagine rivers as historians that never forget, even if they never speak. There is a strange calmness in realizing that before any empire rises, landscapes already establish their own silent order. No rulers, no laws, only repetition shaped by rainfall and sediment. You might even think nature was running its own version of a very stable operating system long before humans ever installed anything. As you continue walking, the horizon remains unbroken, stretching with patient indifference. The absence of sharp boundaries creates a feeling that direction itself is optional here. It is the kind of place where even your sense of urgency feels politely asked to leave the room. Somewhere in distant memory of this land, future civilizations will later identify early urban patterns along river valleys, including sites like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. But in this present moment, none of that has yet taken shape. Everything remains in a quiet prelude, like the pause before a story remembers its own name. You begin to notice how silence here is not empty, but layered, almost structured. It behaves like a presence rather than a void. Scientists sometimes refer to such environments as low auditory entropy zones, though in simpler terms it just feels like the world is gently telling you to slow down. A faint ripple moves across the water, as if the surface of the river briefly remembers something long forgotten. The movement is so delicate that it almost does not exist, like a thought forming at the edge of sleep. Everything remains quiet, yet the water seems gently aware of time. Perhaps it is only the wind passing over the surface, shaping these subtle disturbances without intention or memory. Or perhaps memory itself is only another way of describing motion through time, where every ripple becomes a quiet record of passing moments. Either way, the stillness deepens as you observe there. The landscape continues its unhurried rhythm, unchanged by observation, unconcerned with interpretation. In this stillness, you may begin to feel that you are not walking through history, but rather inside its most patient pause. And somehow that realization does not feel heavy at all. For now, everything remains suspended in this soft equilibrium of land, water, and breath, where beginnings have not yet decided to become events. And as the river continues its endless, gentle course, you find yourself quietly drifting along with it, without needing to arrive anywhere at all. The monsoon winds arrive over South Asia in a slow, predictable rhythm that climate scientists describe as one of the most stable seasonal systems on Earth. You stand beneath this imagined sky, feeling as if the air itself remembers how to move. Even your thoughts begin to load more slowly, like a phone refusing to rush updates at night. You walk through imagined riverine forests where early human communities once settled along fertile banks, long before written history took shape. Archaeological sites such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro reveal traces of these ancient lives. It feels strangely grounding, like discovering your ancestors were already organizing life while forgetting where they placed their modern keys. The soil beneath you carries layers of sediment formed over thousands of years, supporting early rice cultivation in the region's lowlands. Agricultural continuity here is confirmed by geoarchaeological studies of ancient floodplains. You imagine farmers patiently working fields that look almost identical to today, except without email notifications interrupting their seasonal schedules. Rainfall arrives in repeating cycles, shaping perception of time into something less linear and more circular. You begin to notice how monsoon timing feels like a natural calendar written in clouds rather than ink. Even your internal sense of urgency dissolves slightly, like a deadline politely deciding to reschedule itself for next year. In this environment, monsoon memory becomes more than weather, acting like a living archive stored in atmospheric patterns. Scientists often describe it as a coupled ocean-atmosphere system, yet here it feels more like breathing. You half expect the clouds to sigh, as if they are also wondering what tomorrow's forecast will complain about. Archaeological excavations in the Indus Valley reveal structured settlements with remarkably consistent layouts across multiple sites. These discoveries suggest coordinated planning long before modern urban design existed. You imagine ancient planners drawing city grids without digital tools, perhaps muttering softly about how even straight lines require emotional patience. The city of Mohenjo-Daro shows remarkably advanced urban organization, especially in its consistent use of standardized brick sizes across multiple construction phases. This level of uniformity reflects one of the earliest known examples of large-scale urban standardization in human history, suggesting careful coordination and shared construction practices across generations. You imagine ancient builders quietly debating brick alignment with mild frustration, as if precision already mattered more than they fully realized. In their everyday work, they were unknowingly shaping the earliest forms of bureaucracy, where order, measurement, and consistency slowly became invisible rules guiding how entire cities were constructed and maintained. Drainage systems uncovered at Mohenjo-Daro demonstrate sophisticated water management, channeling waste through covered brick networks beneath streets. Archaeologists often highlight this as one of the earliest sanitation infrastructures in the world. You find yourself oddly impressed, imagining ancient engineers quietly outperforming modern plumbing tutorials without any online video guides. Trade networks during this period connect river communities through slow but consistent exchange of goods like beads, textiles, and grains. Movement is steady rather than rapid, forming an early economic rhythm. You picture merchants traveling patiently, without GPS, probably relying on rivers and stars instead of asking for directions every 5 minutes. Agricultural fields expand gradually along seasonal floodplains, adapting to predictable monsoon patterns that renew soil fertility each year. This natural cycle supports long-term stability in food production. You imagine farmers observing rainfall with calm familiarity, unlike modern weather apps that sometimes act like they are emotionally surprised by their own predictions. Wildlife in these regions moves slowly through wetlands and grasslands, shaped by abundant water and seasonal flooding cycles. Elephants, deer, and riverbirds form part of a balanced ecosystem that has evolved in quiet harmony. You begin to see movement here as something patient, steady, and deeply connected to environment itself. They seem to exist without urgency, as if nature has never installed the concept of notifications for danger or deadlines. Every gesture feels unhurried, guided only by instinct and rhythm rather than pressure. In a strange way, this quiet balance resembles a healthier operating system, where nothing demands immediate attention or interruption. One of the most significant historical mysteries of the Indus Valley civilization is its undeciphered script, found on seals and pottery fragments. Despite extensive research, its language remains unreadable today. You imagine ancient scribes writing messages that refuse to translate, like encrypted texts from a civilization that ghosted future historians on purpose. Social organization appears decentralized yet highly coordinated, based on material evidence from settlements and artifact distribution. There is little sign of extreme hierarchy in early phases. You picture a society where collaboration feels more natural than competition, almost like everyone agreed not to argue before breakfast, which feels refreshingly unrealistic today. River systems behave like constant sculptors of land, slowly shifting their channels across centuries while still preserving a fragile ecological balance. These movements are captured in layered sediment records that geologists carefully study over time, revealing how landscapes quietly evolve without sudden interruption or visible urgency. Over long periods, rivers act like patient editors of the Earth's surface, gently rewriting valleys, plains, and deltas through repeated adjustments. Each change is recorded in geological memory, as if nature itself prefers revision over deletion, shaping the world through continuous, almost imperceptible edits rather than abrupt transformation or immediate correction. Climate stability during much of this period allows long-term settlement without frequent catastrophic disruption. Paleoclimate data supports relatively consistent monsoon cycles over extended intervals. You imagine weather behaving like a reliable colleague who always shows up on time, instead of one who constantly calls in unpredictable emotional storms. In a quiet, reflective sense, you may begin to see this entire region as a place where time does not push forward in an aggressive line, but instead folds gently back into itself, like soft layers of memory overlapping without conflict. Ancient life here feels less like linear progress and more like continuous presence, as if existence prefers continuity over urgency. You almost forget what rush hour means, and your mind quietly accepts its absence with surprising ease. As you continue moving through this ancient memory of monsoon landscapes, The boundary between observer and environment begins to soften further. The rivers keep flowing, unchanged by attention or interpretation. And somewhere ahead, the next layer of history waits quietly, as if it has been patiently standing in line for thousands of years. The first organized cities of the Indus Valley begin to appear as carefully arranged patterns of brick and space, almost like someone drew order onto the earth with invisible ink. Archaeologists describe this as one of the earliest examples of planned urban development in human history. You imagine walking through a city that feels unusually calm, like a spreadsheet that somehow became alive. Mohenjo-Daro reveals a carefully planned grid layout, where streets intersect at near right angles with remarkable consistency across the entire city. This level of urban organization is rare in ancient civilizations, suggesting deliberate coordination and shared planning principles. You begin to see the city as a quiet expression of structured order, embedded directly into its physical space. You picture ancient builders aligning roads with patient precision, adjusting each direction as if following an invisible design language rather than improvisation. In their daily work, they may not realize they are creating something that future architects will study as a timeless blueprint of calm urban planning, where order feels natural rather than imposed. Standardized baked bricks are found across multiple Indus sites, indicating a shared system of measurement and construction. This uniformity suggests coordinated governance or cultural agreement over long distances. You find it amusing to imagine ancient workers debating brick size like modern people argue about font choices in presentations that nobody fully reads. Water management systems beneath these cities include covered drainage channels that run parallel to streets. Archaeologists consider this one of the earliest advanced sanitation infrastructures in the world. You imagine ancient engineers proudly showing their underground plumbing like a hidden feature in a very early version of civilization software. Daily life in these cities revolves around agriculture, craft production, and steady exchange of goods in local markets. Weights and measures found in excavations suggest standardized trade practices. You picture merchants calmly weighing goods without digital scales, relying instead on a system that somehow avoided the chaos of approximately correct pricing. Seals made of carved stone appear frequently in Indus archaeological sites, often depicting animals and symbols whose meanings remain undeciphered. These artifacts suggest administrative or commercial usage. You imagine each seal as a tiny password for ancient commerce, except no one today has the correct login credentials anymore. The undeciphered Indus script continues to puzzle researchers, as no bilingual inscription has been found to unlock its meaning. Despite decades of study, its language remains silent. You picture ancient writers intentionally creating messages that resist translation, like sending emails that refuse to open no matter how many devices you try. Urban populations appear to live in relatively uniform housing structures, with limited evidence of extreme wealth disparity in early phases. This suggests a balanced distribution of resources. You imagine neighborhoods where houses quietly agree not to compete in size, almost like an early version of minimalism enforced by social consensus. Food storage facilities and granaries indicate organized agricultural surplus management within these cities. Grain appears to have been collected and redistributed systematically. You picture ancient administrators calmly counting sacks of wheat, while silently wishing someone had already invented barcodes to make their lives slightly more dramatic. Craft specialization is evident in bead-making workshops, pottery production, and metallurgy found across urban centers. These industries suggest a diversified economy supported by stable governance. You imagine artisans focused on repetitive, calming work, like ancient versions of people assembling furniture from extremely confusing instruction scrolls. Trade extends beyond local settlements, linking Indus cities with distant regions such as Mesopotamia and Central Asia through long and steady exchange networks. Archaeological findings reveal imported materials like lapis lazuli and marine shells carried across vast distances. You imagine caravan routes stretching through deserts, where merchants move slowly but consistently, like unstable mobile signals trying to stay connected. These long-distance exchanges suggest a deeply interconnected ancient world, where goods traveled through many intermediate hands before reaching final destinations. Each object carried traces of geography, climate, and culture along its journey. You begin to see trade not as isolated movement, but as a continuous flow of relationships quietly spanning continents over time. The early Indus cities also show a striking absence of monumental palaces or dominant religious structures compared to other ancient civilizations. This suggests a different model of urban organization, where power is not expressed through visual dominance. Archaeological evidence points toward a more evenly structured society with less emphasis on centralized architectural display or symbolic hierarchy. You imagine authority in these cities existing quietly, without grand visual representation, like background software running continuously, without pop-up notifications or interruptions. Governance feels embedded in systems rather than displayed in monuments, shaping daily life subtly rather than dramatically. In this way, power becomes something felt through order, rather than seen through overwhelming structures. Environmental adaptation plays a key role in sustaining these cities, as settlements are built near rivers to support agriculture and transportation. Seasonal flooding enriches surrounding soil. You picture the rivers acting like gentle maintenance crews, quietly refreshing the land every year without needing applause or recognition. Street layouts suggest a strong emphasis on ventilation, movement and sanitation, rather than symbolic or monumental display. Urban planning appears highly practical and efficient, focused on daily livability. You imagine city designers prioritizing airflow, much like modern engineers designing quiet air conditioning systems that go unnoticed until they suddenly stop working. Children in these settlements likely grow up within structured yet stable environments, surrounded by repetitive rhythms of trade and agriculture. Archaeological inference suggests continuity in daily routines. You picture them playing in streets that feel safe and predictable, like a world where nothing randomly changes Wi-Fi passwords. The rhythm of city life remains steady across generations, with very little evidence of abrupt disruption during its early developmental phases. This continuity is clearly reflected in layered archaeological deposits that accumulate over long periods. You begin to feel that time in this setting does not move in sudden leaps, but instead gathers slowly like dust settling on a patient, unchanged surface. As you move through this imagined urban landscape, the noise of ancient civilization is surprisingly soft, almost like distant conversation heard through water. The cities continue their quiet existence, built on repetition and balance. And somewhere beyond these ordered streets, a larger transformation is already waiting, still unseen, but steadily approaching. You move deeper into the quiet architecture of the Indus world, where order does not announce itself loudly but exists like a steady pulse beneath everything. Archaeologists describe a civilization defined less by monumental expression and more by consistent repetition. It feels like walking through a system that never needed explanation. Stone seals appear across excavation layers, each carved with symbols, animals, and markings suggesting administrative use. These artifacts indicate long-term continuity in trade and record-keeping across generations. You imagine ancient merchants stamping goods with calm routine, like pressing confirm on transactions long before digital interfaces existed or required instant feedback. The undeciphered Indus script remains one of archaeology's quiet mysteries, with no bilingual inscription discovered anywhere. Scholars study repetition patterns and structural consistency within symbols across different sites. You find it oddly comforting that ancient writing can remain unreadable, as if history itself occasionally forgets its own passwords, leaving meaning suspended yet still present. Urban material distribution across Indus cities reveals careful planning in resource allocation at a large scale. Bricks, tools, and ceramics appear standardized across vast regions of settlement. This suggests coordinated production systems rather than isolated improvisation. You picture ancient supply chains moving silently across landscapes, like slow messages traveling without notifications or interruption. Even without full decipherment, these material patterns suggest a highly structured society with stable systems of production and exchange. Archaeologists interpret consistency in artifacts as evidence of organization and long-term planning. You begin to see silence in writing not as absence, but as another form of record preserved through objects. Urban material distribution reveals careful planning in resource allocation across Indus cities. Bricks, tools, and ceramics appear standardized over vast regions. This suggests coordinated production systems rather than isolated improvisation. You picture supply chains moving silently across landscapes, like slow messages traveling without notifications or interruptions of any kind. Residential layouts show architectural repetition across settlements, indicating shared cultural or administrative norms. Houses follow similar structural patterns regardless of location. You imagine neighborhoods agreeing on form and proportion. Like an ancient design system, everyone follows instinctively without needing instructions, manuals, or external enforcement of uniformity. Cities demonstrate balance between residential, commercial, and sanitation spaces. Organization prioritizes functionality over symbolic dominance or monumental display. You begin to see these settlements as early experiments in urban ergonomics, where livability quietly replaces spectacle, and efficiency becomes the invisible framework supporting everyday human activity without drawing attention. Trade goods such as beads, metals, shells, and stones reveal long-distance exchange networks. These items reflect sustained economic relationships across regions. You picture caravans moving with patient rhythm, like slow data packets carrying beauty rather than information, crossing landscapes that change slowly beneath their consistent movement patterns. Standardized weights and measures indicate highly uniform commercial systems across cities. This consistency enabled predictable trade interactions and reduced uncertainty. You imagine ancient merchants comparing calibrated stones, debating precision softly, much like modern people argue about battery percentages or small differences that feel disproportionately important in daily routines. Despite unreadable texts, material evidence shows a structured society with stable production cycles. Archaeologists interpret artifact distribution as indirect administrative coordination. You find it fascinating that silence in writing can still produce strong evidence, as if absence of language itself becomes a different form of communication preserved in objects. Water management systems reflect consistent engineering principles, with drainage channels aligned beneath city streets. These systems required maintenance and collective responsibility. You imagine citizens cooperating quietly to keep water flowing, treating infrastructure as shared rhythm rather than burden, like a society agreeing not to let plumbing become chaos. Craft specialization spans pottery, metallurgy, and bead production across multiple centers. Production appears organized and repetitive, suggesting stable demand. You picture artisans working in calm cycles, repeating familiar motions daily, like people assembling furniture that always seems to contain one missing instruction page somewhere in its design. The absence of grand inscriptions or dominant monuments suggests distributed forms of authority. Power may have been expressed through infrastructure rather than display. You imagine governance functioning quietly in the background, like a system update that installs itself without forcing restart or demanding attention from users. Archaeological layers show settlement continuity over centuries, with gradual development. There is little evidence of abrupt restructuring or sudden urban breaks. You begin to feel that time here behaves like sediment, accumulating slowly rather than breaking into sharp divisions, preserving continuity even through long periods of subtle change. Environmental adaptation remains central, as cities align closely with rivers and seasonal cycles that shape survival itself. Flood patterns influence agriculture, settlement placement, and long-term planning decisions. You picture rivers acting like silent consultants, offering yearly feedback without meetings or reports, gently guiding human choices through repetition rather than instruction or direct enforcement. Social organization emphasizes equilibrium rather than expansion across regions, creating a stable but understated form of development. This balance likely reduces internal instability and prevents excessive disruption. You imagine a society where growth is measured not through conquest or display, but through the quiet persistence of routine, where continuity itself becomes the highest achievement. Artistic expression reflects restraint, with simple, balanced designs appearing across surviving artifacts from the period. Beauty seems defined by calm proportion rather than complexity or excess. You begin to think that aesthetics here may have been about preserving stillness, ensuring that visual form never disturbs the surrounding quiet order or harmony. Across this invisible city of structure, nothing feels forced, rushed, or artificially accelerated by external pressure. Everything follows a measured rhythm, as if complexity has been gradually filtered out over generations of careful adaptation. You sense a system that minimizes disturbance rather than maximizing change, sustaining itself through repetition and quiet balance. Beyond this architecture of order, history continues its slow unfolding into later transformations that emerge without abrupt rupture. What remains is not disruption, but gradual evolution of systems already designed to endure over long periods. You begin to feel time itself as continuity rather than sequence, softly unfolding like an unbroken current. As you move through this layered continuity, the world feels less like a chain of isolated events, and more like a long, steady breath that never fully stops or breaks. Every transition blends into the next without sharp edges or sudden interruptions. You quietly observe existence as ongoing flow rather than segmented history. You now drift into a different layer of time, where the quiet order of earlier cities begins to merge into something larger and more structured. The Maurya Empire rises in the 4th century BCE across the vast plains of South Asia. Historians describe this moment as a consolidation of regions once loosely connected by trade and river systems. Chandragupta Maurya establishes one of the earliest large-scale centralized administrations in the Indian subcontinent. Records suggest the use of systematic taxation and bureaucratic oversight. You imagine officials carefully noting grain and goods on early forms of documentation, like people quietly managing a very large spreadsheet without ever naming it as such. This administrative structure is supported by advisors, such as Chanakya, whose treatise Arthashastra outlines principles of governance, economics, and political strategy. The text emphasizes order, intelligence, and structured control. You picture an ancient strategist writing policy advice with the calm confidence of someone explaining how to organize chaos into categories. The empire expands across diverse regions, connecting cities, rivers, and cultural zones into a unified system. Roads and trade routes become essential tools of cohesion. You imagine messengers traveling slowly but consistently, carrying information like carefully folded paper emails that take weeks to arrive but are never marked as urgent. Despite its expansion, the Mauryan system relies heavily on recorded data and administrative memory. Archaeological evidence suggests the use of inscriptions and standardized governance practices. You find it interesting that even ancient empires understood the importance of documentation long before cloud storage became a metaphor for human memory. Then history shifts in tone with the rise of Ashoka, grandson of Chandragupta, as the Mauryan legacy continues into a new generation. His reign initially maintains and extends the expansion of Mauryan control across diverse regions. You sense continuity still holding the system together, like structure inherited without interruption or hesitation. However, the turning point arrives after the Kalinga War, a conflict recorded in historical accounts as particularly devastating in scale and impact. Even the surviving records feel noticeably heavier in tone and implication. You can almost feel how silence itself becomes denser here, as if absence in the record carries its own weight. After the war, Ashoka undergoes a profound transformation in governance philosophy. Inscriptions describe his remorse and reflection on violence. Instead of continuing expansion through force, he begins to promote Dhamma, a principle emphasizing ethical conduct, compassion, and social responsibility. You imagine a ruler suddenly deciding that power should behave more like care than control. This shift is documented across numerous rock and pillar edicts distributed throughout the empire. These inscriptions remain among the most important historical sources of ancient India. You picture massive stone surfaces quietly carrying messages across centuries, like public announcements written in permanence instead of paper. The edicts emphasize non-violence, tolerance, and respect between different communities. They also outline responsibilities of rulers toward their subjects. You begin to see governance here not as domination, but as a form of long-term maintenance, like tending a vast system that must not break under pressure. Ashoka's inscriptions extend beyond political instruction into moral guidance for daily life. They encourage kindness toward animals, honesty in speech, and moderation in behavior. You imagine these messages reaching distant villages, carried slowly by travelers, like gentle reminders instead of commands shouted from above. The spread of Buddhism during this period is closely associated with imperial support, although Ashoka's approach remains inclusive rather than exclusive. Monasteries and stupas begin to appear across the landscape. You picture stone structures rising quietly, not as monuments of conquest, but as resting points for thought and reflection. Historical records indicate that Ashoka sent emissaries to neighboring regions, including parts of Central Asia and the Hellenistic world during his reign. These missions carried teachings, ethical principles, and cultural ideas rather than military objectives or territorial demands. You begin to picture diplomacy unfolding as slow movement across continents, guided by communication instead of conflict or coercion. You imagine these diplomatic journeys as extended conversations between civilizations, rather than negotiations under pressure or urgency. Each envoy becomes a quiet messenger of ideas, traveling through landscapes and languages with patience. The exchange feels less like strategy and more like shared understanding, gradually forming across distance, as if dialogue itself becomes the primary form of connection. Archaeological findings show that infrastructure such as roads, rest houses, and administrative centers expanded significantly during the Mauryan period. These developments supported both governance and communication. You picture a network of ancient highways functioning like veins of a very large, carefully maintained organism. The transformation under Ashoka is often interpreted by historians as one of the earliest examples of ethical governance on a large scale in recorded history. While political power remains centralized, its expression gradually shifts in tone and intention. You begin to sense authority, learning how to speak more softly without disappearing. Even after Ashoka's reign, his inscriptions continue to stand across the landscape, weathered yet still readable in many regions today. Stone becomes a medium for continuity, resisting erosion, climate, and the slow passage of time itself. You imagine messages patiently waiting centuries to be read, like thoughts that refuse to fully fade away. This enduring presence of inscriptions creates a bridge between past governance and present observation, allowing later generations to encounter imperial intentions directly. Each carved surface functions as both document and monument, preserving not only information, but also tone. You begin to feel history speaking through material rather than narrative alone. This period does not erase earlier systems, but overlays them with new meaning, blending administrative structure with reflection and ethical interpretation. The empire becomes both functional and philosophical in character, expanding beyond governance into moral expression. You find it poetic that systems of power can briefly attempt self-understanding. In this layered transformation, governance evolves into something that reflects upon its own influence while still maintaining order across vast territories. You sense history becoming more introspective, as if authority itself is learning to observe its consequences. And in that quiet shift, power becomes less force, more awareness. As you move through this transformation, the rhythm of history remains slow and steady, like water flowing through layered stone channels. Nothing feels abrupt, only gradually reoriented. And ahead, the story continues to unfold, as power begins to express itself not only through expansion, but through the quiet attempt to create balance. You now enter a quieter layer of history, where words are no longer written on fragile materials but carved directly into stone itself across the landscapes of ancient India, Nepal, and Afghanistan. The Edicts of Ashoka still remain, standing like patient witnesses, waiting for centuries to pass before they are read again by distant generations far beyond their origin. These inscriptions are found on rock faces, pillars, and natural outcrops carefully selected for visibility and long-term endurance in diverse environments. Archaeologists classify them as some of the earliest surviving examples of state communication carved into permanent material. You imagine messages engraved with slow precision, like someone typing history directly into the Earth's memory, line by line, without interruption. The content of these edicts reflects a philosophy of governance centered on Dhamma, emphasizing compassion, tolerance, and ethical responsibility across society. Ashoka's voice appears not as command, but as reflection and guidance for collective behavior. You find it strangely modern, like a leader writing public notes that sound more like advice than rigid authority or imposed instruction. Across all these inscriptions, there is a consistent tone of moral reflection that replaces fear with awareness and obligation with understanding. Governance becomes something closer to dialogue than domination, even when expressed through stone. You begin to see authority not as force, but as a carefully carved invitation to think differently about power. Many inscriptions explicitly discourage violence and encourage respect between different religious and social groups across the empire. This approach is considered unusual for ancient imperial systems that typically relied on dominance and force. You picture a ruler trying to reduce conflict through carefully worded reminders etched into stone walls, like permanent notifications that remain visible across generations without ever disappearing. Some edicts address the treatment of animals, promoting non-harm and regulated hunting practices within everyday life. Historians often highlight this as an early expression of ethical environmental awareness embedded within governance itself. You imagine ancient hunters pausing mid-thought after reading carved messages, reconsidering their actions under the quiet pressure of written reflection that does not shout but gently persists. Other inscriptions focus on administrative fairness and moral duties expected from officials across different regions of the empire. Governors are instructed to act justly, avoid corruption, and maintain balance in local governance structures. You picture bureaucrats standing silently before stone texts, adjusting their behavior as if they had always intended such responsibility, only needing gentle reminders to align actions. The geographical spread of these inscriptions reveals an extensive communication network spanning the vast Mauryan Empire. They are found in both remote landscapes and major urban centers, suggesting deliberate and strategic placement. You begin to see stone as an ancient broadcasting system, transmitting governance across mountains, rivers, deserts, and distant regions without sound or urgency. Archaeological studies confirm that Mauryan roads and trade routes connected distant cultural and economic regions across the subcontinent. These networks supported not only commerce but also administrative cohesion among diverse populations. You imagine caravans moving slowly along dusty roads, carrying goods and ideas like quiet packets of civilization data, traveling steadily across long distances. Some inscriptions are written in multiple scripts, including Brahmi and Kharosti, reflecting the linguistic diversity within the Mauryan Empire's vast territorial expanse. This multilingual approach suggests practical administrative adaptability rather than rigid uniformity in communication systems across regions. You picture scribes carefully selecting symbols, like someone trying to write the same message across different keyboard layouts without making mistakes or losing meaning. The physical endurance of these stone carvings is remarkable, with many remaining legible after more than 2 millennia of continuous exposure to natural environmental conditions. Weathering has softened edges and surfaces over time, but it has not erased meaning entirely from the inscriptions. You begin to think of stone as a long-term storage system that refuses to forget anything important, even across vast stretches of time. In some locations, inscriptions are placed deliberately near travel routes, suggesting they were intended for repeated public reading by passing merchants and travelers. These individuals likely encountered moral and administrative guidance during long journeys across imperial territories. You imagine people pausing briefly on dusty roads, absorbing messages like modern travelers reading roadside signs. The tone of the edicts remains consistent across all regions, reinforcing a unified ethical framework throughout the empire's diverse cultural landscape. This consistency suggests careful centralized oversight in message composition, editing, and distribution. You picture an ancient administration quietly reviewing phrasing, fully aware that tone itself shapes how authority is perceived. Religious pluralism is acknowledged in several inscriptions, encouraging respect for different traditions across society under Mauryan rule. Historians often note this as a distinctive feature of Ashokan policy within imperial history. You imagine an empire quietly stating that disagreement does not require destruction, a message that still feels unexpectedly contemporary even in modern perspectives today. The inscriptions also emphasize reflection and self-examination for both rulers and subjects across all levels of society within the Mauryan administrative worldview. This introduces a moral dimension to governance rarely seen in earlier imperial systems of authority. You begin to see leadership here as continuous adjustment, a process rather than a fixed position of absolute control, always evolving through awareness and careful reflection over time. Trade routes mentioned in archaeological records show sustained exchange across Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent during this historical period. Goods such as textiles, spices, metals, and stones moved steadily across vast distances through interconnected networks. You picture commerce flowing like a calm river, carrying culture, material goods, and human connection along its unbroken path through diverse regions and landscapes over centuries. Even after the decline of the Mauryan Empire, these inscriptions remain physically present across vast landscapes, enduring through centuries of environmental and cultural change. They outlive the political system that originally created them and slowly become part of collective historical memory itself. You find it quietly poetic that messages carved in stone can survive their authors by thousands of years. As you move among these carved stones in your mind, the atmosphere feels stiller and heavier, as if meaning itself has slowly accumulated in the air over centuries. Each inscription stands like a pause in time, carefully preserved against forgetting, erosion, and the quiet indifference whether, and beyond these silent pillars, the world continues its slow, unbroken movement toward whatever transformation comes next. You now observe a phase of history where expansion does not feel like rupture, but more like a slow widening of an already flowing river across the vast landscapes of South Asia. The Maurya Empire extends its boundaries steadily across diverse regions. Historians often note that this form of growth appears less chaotic than earlier conquest models in ancient imperial history. This gradual expansion unfolds with a sense of continuity rather than disruption, as administrative structures extend outward in measured stages. Rather than sudden breaks, territories seem to absorb into a wider system already in motion. You begin to see empire not as a sharp event, but as a slow geographical breathing that reshapes space without dramatic interruption. Territories are integrated through administrative systems rather than constant cycles of military disruption or repeated conflict. Local governors are appointed to maintain order under a centralized but flexible framework. You imagine officials arriving in distant towns not with loud declarations, but with calm instructions, organized records, and quiet expectations that governance should feel structured rather than disruptive or overwhelming. Taxation systems are standardized across regions, allowing resources to be collected and distributed in more predictable and regulated patterns throughout the empire. Archaeological evidence suggests remarkable consistency in administrative seals, documentation practices, and long-term record-keeping systems. You picture ancient accountants quietly updating ledgers by lamplight, treating the management of an entire empire like a vast but orderly bookkeeping exercise stretching across civilizations and generations. Road networks expand steadily to connect provincial centers with the imperial core, strengthening communication and mobility. These routes support both trade movement and administrative coordination across diverse territories. You imagine messengers traveling along dusty paths, carrying information that moves slowly but steadily, like thoughts drifting across long afternoons without urgency or sudden interruption anywhere. Despite political unification, local cultures continue to exist within the broader imperial structure without being erased. Regional traditions remain visible in material culture, language use, and burial practices across different areas. You begin to see the empire not as replacement of diversity, but as a thin organizational layer gently resting above deeply persistent local identities underneath. Religious traditions coexist across regions under Mauryan governance, forming a diverse but stable cultural environment. Archaeological findings indicate multiple belief systems operating within shared administrative zones. You picture temples, shrines, and local rituals existing side by side, like different playlists playing softly in adjacent rooms, never competing loudly but simply coexisting in parallel rhythms. Ashoka's policies of Dhamma continue influencing governance throughout this phase of expansion and consolidation. Ethical guidelines encourage tolerance, compassion, and social responsibility among officials and citizens alike. You imagine imperial officers reading these principles like internal reminders, similar to quiet messages asking everyone to remain calm, considerate, and aware of their actions in daily governance. Integration of new regions often involves adaptation rather than replacement of existing local systems and traditions. Pre-existing social structures are incorporated into broader administrative networks with minimal disruption. You find it interesting that expansion here feels more like merging folders in a system rather than deleting previous files or overwriting entire structures completely. Archaeological layers reveal continuity in both urban and rural settlement patterns across newly incorporated territories. There is limited evidence of abrupt cultural displacement or sudden structural interruption. You picture landscapes gradually adjusting to new governance, like software updates that refine interface design without breaking core functionality or disrupting underlying processes already in place. Trade flows increase significantly during this period, connecting distant regions within the vast imperial system. Goods, ideas, and materials move more freely across administrative boundaries than in earlier fragmented periods. You imagine merchants benefiting from predictable routes, like travelers finally discovering a road system that does not randomly disappear or change without explanation. Military presence exists but appears less dominant in daily governance compared to earlier models of expansion and control. Fortifications are present in strategic locations but are not always emphasized in urban environments. You picture soldiers blending into administrative life, functioning more like background security systems than visible instruments of constant enforcement or pressure. Some regions maintain semi-autonomous governance while still acknowledging overarching imperial authority and structure. This flexible arrangement allows adaptation to local conditions while preserving overall cohesion. You begin to see the empire as a layered system where control is expressed through alignment, coordination, and shared principles rather than strict uniformity everywhere. Cultural exchange increases noticeably between regions as mobility improves across the empire's extensive network. Art styles, languages, and technologies begin to show shared influences and gradual blending. You imagine artisans borrowing patterns from distant provinces, like creative ideas traveling through invisible channels, connecting workshops across continents without direct contact. Environmental adaptation remains essential, as newly incorporated territories require different agricultural strategies and seasonal planning. Local knowledge is incorporated into broader administrative decision-making. You picture officials listening carefully to farmers, trying to understand how weather behaves differently in each village, as if each landscape has its own quiet language. Infrastructure development continues steadily, including roads, rest houses, and administrative posts distributed across key routes. These structures support long-distance governance and sustained mobility across the empire. You imagine travelers stopping at quiet way stations, resting briefly before continuing journeys through landscapes that feel increasingly connected and less fragmented over time. Despite expansion, there is relatively limited evidence of widespread cultural suppression within newly integrated regions across the empire's growing territories. Instead, coexistence appears to function as a practical necessity of governance rather than an exception. You begin to feel that stability here is not imposed through force alone, but maintained through careful balance, adaptation, and continuous adjustment across diverse populations over time. Over time, the empire reaches its greatest territorial extent, spanning multiple ecological zones and cultural landscapes simultaneously across a vast and diverse geography. Yet the system remains surprisingly cohesive in its administrative function despite this scale. You imagine this immense structure operating like a slow-moving organism, where every part communicates quietly without noise, urgency, or visible strain anywhere. As you move through this phase of expansion, the sensation of movement remains gentle rather than dramatic or abrupt in historical terms. Nothing breaks suddenly. Everything stretches, adjusts, and continues in gradual motion across regions. And beyond this quiet widening of power, history begins preparing for a different kind of change, shaped not by growth alone, but by transformation from within. You now drift into a quieter aftermath of empire, where political structure loosens but cultural memory continues to breathe across former Mauryan territories. After the gradual weakening of centralized authority, regional areas do not collapse into silence or disorder. Instead, they begin carrying fragments of the old system forward in subtle and continuous ways that remain visible in everyday administrative life and social organization. Administrative practices inherited from the Mauryan period remain visible in local governance structures across many regions. Tax collection methods, documentation habits, and record-keeping systems are adapted rather than discarded entirely. You imagine officials continuing familiar procedures, like maintaining an old workflow after the original software has already been updated, preserving continuity even as political frameworks slowly shift into new configurations. Road networks and trade routes persist across regions, maintaining essential connections between distant communities and settlements. These pathways now serve more cultural exchange and economic continuity than direct imperial control. You picture travelers moving through landscapes where political borders feel softer, like lines drawn in sand that gradually shift with wind and time rather than fixed carved boundaries. In this transitional phase, Buddhism begins to expand more visibly as both a cultural and artistic force across many regions. Early Buddhist art flourishes in areas once connected by Mauryan administrative influence and infrastructure. You imagine stone sculptures emerging slowly from workshops, like ideas taking physical form through patient repetition, refinement, and gradual transmission across generations of artisans. Religious expression becomes increasingly localized while blending with pre-existing traditions in each region. Archaeological findings reveal hybrid iconography that merges different symbolic systems into shared visual languages. You find it interesting how belief systems here do not replace one another completely, but instead overlap like transparent layers of meaning that coexist without erasing earlier cultural foundations beneath them. Stupas and early monastic complexes begin appearing across the landscape, marking important centers of spiritual activity, teaching, and community gathering during this transitional period. These structures are often built in continuity with earlier Mauryan sites, or along established trade and travel routes. You picture quiet stone domes rising from the earth, like thoughts that chose to remain visible in the world instead of fading into memory or silence. Artisans adapt earlier imperial styles into more expressive and regionally distinct artistic forms over time. Sculpture techniques evolve gradually, while still maintaining recognizable structural continuity from earlier traditions. You imagine craftsmen working slowly under soft, natural light, refining stone surfaces like someone gently editing memory rather than rewriting it completely or erasing previous creative foundations. Inscriptions from later periods still reference earlier administrative frameworks, showing the lingering influence of Mauryan governance systems. Even as political unity fades, intellectual and bureaucratic continuity remains present across regions. You begin to see history here not as something that ends abruptly, but as something that slowly dissolves into new cultural and administrative forms over time. Local languages and scripts continue evolving gradually, influenced by both indigenous traditions and earlier imperial communication systems that once connected vast regions. This ongoing linguistic blending creates new forms of expression that reflect growing regional diversity across different communities. You picture language itself as a living river, slowly changing direction while still carrying faint traces of its original source through shifting currents that move across time, memory, and geography. Trade continues across former imperial regions, though now with more decentralized coordination between local centers. Goods move along familiar routes, sustaining economic stability and regional interdependence. You imagine merchants still following the same paths as before, like travelers who remember roads long after maps and administrative systems have been rewritten or reorganized. Cultural exchange intensifies as regional identities become more distinct, yet remain interconnected through shared heritage. Artistic motifs travel across territories, reappearing in modified and locally adapted forms. You notice how creativity behaves like a memory system that enjoys variation, constantly remixing familiar patterns into new shapes while preserving recognizable underlying structures. Religious and philosophical ideas circulate more freely without strict centralized oversight from imperial authority. This allows local interpretations and practices to develop organically within each region. You imagine ideas spreading quietly from village to village, like soft conversations carried by wind rather than formal announcements delivered through administrative channels or official decree. The absence of strong central authority does not lead to cultural disappearance or collapse of shared traditions. Instead, it creates space for diversity to stabilize across many smaller cultural centers. You begin to feel that fragmentation here is not collapse, but redistribution of cultural weight across a wider landscape of interconnected yet independent regions. Archaeological evidence shows continuity in craftsmanship techniques, especially in pottery, metallurgy, and sculptural traditions across generations. These skills are passed down with minimal interruption despite political changes above them. You picture artisans teaching apprentices patiently, like slow transmission of knowledge that values repetition, observation, and silence more than urgency or rapid transformation. Buddhist narrative art becomes increasingly prominent during this period, gradually spreading across monastic sites and regional cultural centers. These visual works depict scenes drawn from earlier teachings, philosophical reflections, and foundational episodes of Buddhist tradition. They function simultaneously as religious expression and as a method of preserving cultural memory across generations. You imagine entire walls filled with carved stories, like ancient comic strips etched carefully into stone instead of ink, quietly enduring through centuries. Regional kingdoms begin to emerge, each adapting inherited Mauryan influences in different ways while developing local governance structures. Political organization becomes more localized, but still reflects earlier administrative principles and frameworks. You see political structure shifting like a broken mirror, where each fragment still carries part of the original image in altered form. Despite political fragmentation, cultural cohesion remains surprisingly strong across many regions and communities. Shared artistic motifs, trade routes, and religious ideas maintain subtle unity beneath surface differences. You begin to understand that culture here behaves less like a rigid structure and more like a soft field that continues even when formal borders change or disappear. As you move through this landscape of cultural blending, nothing feels abrupt, isolated, or completely disconnected from what came before. Everything appears to settle, transform, and gradually reorganize rather than break or disappear entirely. Beneath this quiet layering of traditions, history continues its slow movement toward new forms of connection, waiting patiently for the next phase to unfold. You now enter a phase of history where movement exists, yet it feels strangely calm, as if motion itself has learned to slow down across vast distances. Ancient trade routes continue to connect the Indian subcontinent with Central Asia and the Mediterranean world. You imagine these routes stretching like invisible threads across continents, binding distant regions together through steady, almost imperceptible continuity over long spans of time. Caravans travel through deserts, mountains, and river valleys, carrying goods that represent entirely different climates and cultural worlds. Archaeological and textual records from multiple civilizations confirm the importance of these long-distance exchange networks. You picture merchants moving patiently across landscapes, like slow data streams crossing systems that do not hurry to respond or interrupt their gradual passage through space. Spices from southern regions, textiles from fertile river valleys, and precious stones from mountain territories circulate through these interconnected networks. Each item carries not only material value, but also traces of its geographical origin and cultural context. You imagine every object as a small fragment of geography, quietly migrating across the ancient world while preserving invisible memories of where it came from. Trade hubs emerge at key intersections where routes converge, creating natural points of exchange, rest, and reorganization. These centers function as temporary pauses within long and demanding journeys across continents. You picture travelers stopping there not in urgency, but in quiet rhythm, like devices slowly syncing their systems before continuing forward along familiar but distant pathways. Historical records suggest that the Mauryan Empire once played a stabilizing role within certain parts of this broader and long-distance trade network across Asia. Even after its political decline, many routes established during its administrative period remain actively used by merchants and travelers. You begin to see infrastructure as something that outlives authority, continuing to function long after rulers have faded. What remains is not the memory of control, but the persistence of paths, roads, and systems that quietly continue their purpose without needing recognition. These structures carry movement forward across generations, even when their origins are no longer clearly remembered. You start to understand that history often survives not through power itself, but through the slow endurance of the networks it once created. The flow of goods remains steady rather than explosive, following predictable seasonal patterns shaped by environmental conditions. Monsoon cycles indirectly influence timing and direction of movement across multiple regions. You imagine merchants reading weather like a slow calendar, where clouds, winds, and humidity determine when movement becomes possible or naturally restrained by the rhythm of climate. Central Asia functions as a cultural bridge between Eastern and Western trade worlds, channeling goods through multiple intermediaries before they reach distant markets. You picture objects passing slowly through many hands, languages, and landscapes, like stories whispered repeatedly across generations till they gradually reach their final destination with softened edges but preserved meaning. The Mediterranean world receives goods that have traveled thousands of kilometers through layered and overlapping networks of exchange spanning continents and cultures. These items often pass through multiple intermediaries, each adding subtle cultural and linguistic filters before they reach their final destinations. You find it fascinating how physical distance does not prevent interaction between civilizations, but instead gently reshapes it, transforming direct contact into a more indirect yet persistent influence that unfolds slowly over time. Economic activity during this period is decentralized yet highly interconnected across vast geographical regions. No single center fully controls the entire system, yet overall stability is maintained through repetition and shared practice. You imagine the network behaving like a quiet web, where every strand vibrates gently in response to movement without collapsing into disorder or unpredictability. Port cities along coastal routes emerge as essential nodes within expanding maritime trade systems. Ships carry goods across seas using seasonal winds, currents, and coastal navigation knowledge. You picture vessels moving slowly across wide waters, guided by stars and wind patterns, like floating thoughts crossing a dark and infinite reflective surface. The Indian Ocean trade network begins to show early signs of long-term structural continuity, linking Africa, Arabia, and South Asia. This maritime system develops alongside overland routes, forming a complementary global exchange framework. You imagine ocean currents as silent highways, carrying ships with a patience and consistency that only natural systems can maintain across centuries. Cultural exchange accompanies economic movement, as ideas travel alongside physical goods across regions and civilizations. Artistic motifs, technologies, and symbolic systems spread gradually through repeated contact. You see innovation not as sudden invention, but as slow adaptation shaped by continuous interaction, like echoes refining themselves each time they are passed forward. Despite vast distances, the rhythm of exchange remains remarkably consistent over many centuries of sustained activity. Seasonal trade cycles regulate the flow of movement across land and sea. You begin to feel that time here is not fragmented into isolated moments, but structured like breathing, with predictable pauses, returns, and gentle continuity. Markets in local towns function as points where vast global networks briefly become visible and tangible within everyday human life. Here, goods that have traveled from distant regions are finally seen, touched, and exchanged by ordinary people in quiet routines. You imagine a marketplace where the entire world temporarily compresses into a single space of observation, exchange, and shared human presence. Wealth distribution varies across regions, yet trade does not immediately disrupt existing social structures or local arrangements. Economic differences exist, but they unfold gradually rather than causing sudden systemic collapse. You picture societies adjusting slowly, like landscapes reshaping themselves after long rainfall, rather than being transformed by sudden or violent storms. The endurance of these trade systems suggests deep institutional resilience embedded within geography, habit, and long-term cultural practice. Routes persist because they align naturally with terrain, climate, and human behavior over generations. You begin to see commerce not as disruption, but as continuity expressed through movement, repetition, and quiet persistence across time. As you move through this world of silent exchange, everything feels balanced between motion and stillness, as if neither ever fully dominates the other. Goods travel endlessly across continents, yet nothing feels rushed or unstable in its underlying rhythm. And beyond this steady flow of trade, history continues its slow unfolding, preparing for shifts that will reshape regions without breaking their quiet, enduring cadence. You now enter a phase where the outline of empire begins to soften, as if drawn in sand slowly touched by water along shifting shores. The Mauryan political structure, once vast and unified across South Asia, gradually dissolves into smaller regional kingdoms. Historians describe this not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow redistribution of authority across time and space. Administrative regions that once reported directly to a central authority begin to function with increasing independence and local discretion. Local rulers adapt existing systems rather than discarding them entirely, preserving continuity within change. You imagine old bureaucratic frameworks continuing quietly in the background, like processes that remain active even after the main structure has already shifted into a new form. Taxation methods, record-keeping practices, and legal norms persist in modified forms across successor states and emerging regional polities throughout the former imperial landscape. Archaeological evidence suggests strong continuity in governance tools, such as seals, inscriptions, and standardized documentation practices. You picture officials still stamping records in familiar, steady rhythms, as if institutional memory carries its own inertia, quietly shaping administrative behavior through generations of gradual and continuous evolution over time. Road networks remain in use even as political unity fragments into multiple regional centers of power. These routes continue to connect cities, markets, and cultural hubs across changing boundaries. You imagine travelers moving along familiar paths, noticing that borders exist more on maps than in lived experience, like invisible lines layered over landscapes that remain physically unchanged. Regional kingdoms emerge with distinct identities, yet many inherit administrative traditions from the earlier Mauryan system. This creates overlapping layers of governance that coexist across territories rather than replacing one another entirely. You begin to see political space as something stratified, like geological formations where older layers remain visible beneath newer structures forming above them. The decline of centralized authority does not erase earlier infrastructure, but instead redirects it toward local governance needs. Roads, buildings, and administrative centers are repurposed to serve new regional functions. You picture ancient administrative spaces continuing their existence in altered form, their original purpose fading while their physical structure quietly supports evolving systems of control. Historians emphasize that this period should be understood as transformation rather than abrupt collapse or sudden disappearance of order. Power shifts gradually between regions over extended periods of time. You find it interesting that history rarely breaks cleanly, instead preferring transitions that resemble slow atmospheric changes, where pressure, temperature, and direction shift without visible rupture. Coinage systems continue circulating across successor states, often maintaining earlier iconographic and stylistic influences. Economic continuity persists even as political boundaries and authorities change. You imagine coins passing through many hands across regions, carrying symbols of forgotten unity, like small metallic memories that outlive the political structures that originally produced them. Cultural practices remain surprisingly stable, despite increasing political fragmentation across the former imperial landscape. Religious traditions, artistic styles, and social customs continue across regions with only gradual adaptation. You begin to feel that culture moves more slowly than governance, like sediment settling quietly long after the water above has changed direction and flow. Trade routes continue functioning across fragmented territories, ensuring economic and cultural connectivity between increasingly independent regions. Merchants adapt to new political conditions without fundamentally altering established networks of exchange. You picture commerce flowing through shifting borders like water finding new paths through the same terrain, always adjusting but never fully stopping. Some cities experience shifts in importance as regional capitals rise, stabilize, and eventually decline over generations. Urban hierarchies adjust gradually, rather than suddenly collapsing or reorganizing overnight. You imagine cities quietly competing not through conflict, but through endurance, like long-distance runners pacing themselves across centuries of slow and continuous historical movement. Inscriptions from this period often reflect localized authority, while still echoing earlier imperial language and administrative vocabulary across different regions. This suggests a strong continuity in bureaucratic expression, despite increasing political decentralization and fragmentation. You picture scribes copying older formulas almost unconsciously, like repeating inherited phrases from a language that continues shaping thought long after its original imperial context has gradually faded into historical memory. Religious patronage becomes increasingly regionally focused, with local rulers supporting specific institutions, sects, and traditions within their own territories. This decentralization encourages greater diversity in religious expression across different cultural centers and communities. You begin to see spiritual life as something distributed across many interconnected nodes, no longer anchored to a single imperial center, but sustained through multiple overlapping systems that evolve gradually over time. Environmental factors continue shaping settlement patterns, as rivers, soils, and agricultural zones determine population stability across regions. Geography remains a constant influence even as political systems transform above it. You imagine nature as the quiet editor of human organization, revising boundaries and possibilities without announcement, debate, or resistance. Military structures persist in regional forms, adapted to local conditions rather than maintaining imperial-scale organization. Conflict continues, but it becomes increasingly fragmented and geographically limited in scope. You picture armies that feel smaller in scale, like echoes of a once larger structure still reverberating through time, gradually losing amplitude, coherence, and reach, yet never fully disappearing from the historical landscape altogether across generations slowly vary. Despite political fragmentation, intellectual and artistic continuity remains clearly visible across many regions through shared knowledge systems, educational practices, and long-standing cultural traditions. Ideas are transmitted through both formal institutions and informal networks of cultural exchange, adapting as they move. You begin to feel that ideas travel more smoothly than political authority, like light passing through broken glass, still retaining its brightness, clarity, and subtle coherence even across fractured spaces. Over time, the memory of a unified empire becomes increasingly symbolic rather than functional within administrative reality across regions. It exists more in cultural awareness, shared imagination, and historical reference than in active political organization or direct governance structures. You imagine history itself slowly rewriting its own map, replacing sharp, clearly defined borders with softer recollections shaped by distance, interpretation, and the gradual fading of immediate experience. As you move through this fading landscape of political boundaries, nothing disappears completely or abruptly into silence. Everything transforms, disperses, and continues in altered but recognizable forms across time. And beyond this quiet dissolution of unity, history prepares for new arrangements, where continuity survives not through central control, but through persistent adaptation. You now arrive at a layer of history, where empires feel distant, almost irrelevant to the daily rhythm of survival across vast rural landscapes. Dynasties rise and fall above the surface of time, yet life on the ground continues with remarkable steadiness and continuity. Agriculture and village life persist through cycles that seem older than any recorded ruler, shaped more by environment than by political authority above. Fields are tilled in the same seasonal rhythm that has existed for generations across South Asia. Anthropological studies show strong continuity in traditional farming practices despite frequent political change. You imagine farmers working the soil with calm familiarity, as if each season is simply a returning guest who never truly leaves, but quietly reappears in a predictable rhythm of life and labor. Rice cultivation follows monsoon patterns that determine the entire agricultural calendar across many regions. The arrival of rain signals planting, while dry months guide harvesting, storage, and preparation for the next cycle. You begin to see weather not as background condition, but as the main organizer of human routine, quietly structuring decisions without announcement, instruction, or any visible form of authority. Village settlements remain relatively stable across centuries, often occupying the same geographical locations near water sources and fertile land. Archaeological layers reveal gradual continuity rather than sudden relocation or abandonment. You picture villages gently rebuilding themselves in place, like living organisms renewing cells without ever changing their overall position, maintaining identity through persistence rather than movement. Daily life revolves around predictable cycles of work, rest, and communal activity that rarely deviate in structure across generations. Tasks such as irrigation, food preparation, and craft production follow seasonal timing shaped entirely by environmental necessity and long-standing practice. You imagine time here moving like a slow wheel, turning steadily without urgency or interruption, always returning to familiar positions that define rhythm, balance, and a quiet sense of continuity. Social structures in rural communities often preserve older customs even as political systems evolve far above them over long historical spans. Rituals, oral traditions, and local governance continue with minimal disruption across generations, maintaining familiar patterns of daily life. You begin to feel that culture here behaves like memory embedded in the soil itself, surviving every change above it while remaining quietly stable, continuous and deeply rooted in its underlying structure. Anthropologists note that kinship systems and village organization show long-term resilience across many generations. Family structures maintain continuity even as external authority shifts repeatedly over time. You picture households passing down knowledge quietly, like handwritten notes that survive long after the original author has been forgotten, still guiding daily life through inherited understanding and shared experience. Agricultural tools and techniques also show remarkable consistency across extended historical periods. Simple ploughs, irrigation channels, and storage methods persist with only gradual refinement rather than radical transformation. You imagine innovation here moving slowly, like small adjustments made by experience rather than sudden invention, shaped more by necessity than by deliberate technological disruption. The monsoon cycle continues to dominate environmental planning, shaping both agricultural success and social stability throughout entire regions across South Asia. Its predictable seasonal rhythm allows rural communities to adapt without crisis, disruption, or structural breakdown over generations. You begin to feel that rain is not just weather, but a shared agreement between land, sky, and people, repeated each year with quiet reliability, emotional familiarity, and natural rhythmic order. Markets in rural areas operate on regular schedules aligned closely with harvest cycles and seasonal agricultural availability across villages and settlements. Goods are exchanged in predictable intervals rather than continuous flow, constant demand, or accelerated commercial pressure. You picture small gatherings of trade forming like quiet pulses in time, appearing and disappearing with seasonal rhythm, gently connecting communities without overwhelming the slower, steady pace of rural life and its calm continuity. Even when political authority changes, taxation and local administration often remain integrated into existing village systems. External governance adapts to local structures rather than replacing them entirely or abruptly. You imagine officials arriving occasionally, like brief visitors to a system that already knows how to function, observing rather than disrupting established patterns of daily organization. Religious practices in rural communities reflect deep continuity, often blending older traditions with newer influences over long periods. Ritual calendars remain closely tied to agricultural cycles and environmental timing. You begin to see spirituality here as something woven into daily survival, not separated from it, but embedded within work, seasons, and the quiet repetition of life. Environmental knowledge is passed down orally through generations, covering rainfall patterns, soil behavior, and seasonal timing with remarkable precision. This accumulated understanding functions as a living archive that evolves slowly over time. You imagine elders speaking softly about weather patterns as if they are reading from a book only nature has written and continually updates. Food preparation and storage techniques remain stable across long periods, reflecting careful adaptation to local environmental conditions. Fermentation, drying, and seasonal preservation ensure survival through changing climates and uncertain harvests. You picture kitchens as quiet laboratories of continuity, where tradition is maintained through repetition, observation, and inherited practice, rather than formal instruction or written documentation. Despite external disruptions in broader political history, village life absorbs change without losing its core structural patterns across generations. External events often feel distant compared to immediate seasonal concerns, agricultural cycles, and daily responsibilities that define lived experience. You begin to sense that the most important history here is not written in chronicles or official records, but in repetition itself, quietly embedded in everyday actions, habits, and long-standing survival routines. Oral storytelling preserves collective memory of past events across generations, blending historical fact with interpretation, symbolism, and local understanding shaped by community experience. Stories evolve gradually as they are passed from one generation of listeners to the next, never remaining completely fixed. You imagine narratives changing slightly with each telling, like rivers gently altering their course over time while still flowing in the same direction towards shared memory and cultural continuity. As you move through this landscape of continuity, you begin to realize that stability does not mean absence of change in human history. It means change that moves slowly enough to feel like stillness across generations. And beyond this quiet persistence of life, history continues its gentle unfolding, preparing for transitions that remain almost invisible at ground level, yet deeply persistent. You now step back beyond human memory, into a scale of time where empires no longer feel like structured systems, but like brief ripples on an immense and continuous surface. From a geological perspective, everything you have witnessed becomes a fleeting moment in Earth's long unfolding history. You begin to feel time stretching far beyond human comprehension, dissolving the usual boundaries between events, eras, and civilizations. The rivers that once shaped civilizations continue their slow, patient movement across the land without interruption or urgency through vast stretches of time. The Ganges flows as it has for thousands of years, carrying sediment, memory, and silence in equal measure through constantly shifting terrain and evolving landscapes. You imagine the river not as a fixed path, but as a continuous act of writing that never stops revising itself. This writing unfolds layer by layer across centuries, where each current reshapes the previous line without ever fully erasing it. The river becomes both movement and record, quietly inscribing history into the earth as it flows. You begin to see it as a living manuscript of time itself, where every turn of water is another sentence added without haste or final destination. Layers of sediment gradually accumulate over archaeological remains, softening the edges of human presence with each passing century. Over time, buildings, roads, and inscriptions become indistinguishable from natural soil formations and geological deposits. You begin to understand that nature does not erase history, it gently absorbs it into itself, folding human traces into its own slow processes of transformation. Geologists describe this process as stratification, where each layer of Earth preserves a fragment of environmental and human past. Ancient civilizations become thin traces embedded within rock, clay, and mineral structures. You imagine entire empires resting quietly beneath your feet, like forgotten thoughts pressed into the ground, waiting not to be remembered, but simply to exist as part of deeper time. Even the most powerful political systems eventually dissolve into geological silence over vast stretches of time. Borders vanish, cities collapse, and only mineral traces remain within shifting layers of earth. You find it strangely peaceful that nothing built by humans is ever truly lost, only transformed into something less visible, yet still quietly present within the planet's long memory. The soundscape of this world becomes increasingly subtle as attention deepens and perception slows. The rivers flow, the wind through distant trees, and the shifting of soil merge into a single continuous tone of existence. You begin to feel that silence is not absence but composition, a layered presence formed by everything that has ever moved and settled. Scientific studies of sediment cores reveal long sequences of environmental change recorded layer by layer over thousands of years. These natural archives preserve evidence of climate shifts, ecological transitions, and traces of human activity within compacted Earth. You imagine Earth itself as a patient historian, recording everything without judgment, annotation, or selective memory. As you observe this deep time perspective, the boundaries between natural systems and human history begin to blur and soften. Civilizations appear as temporary configurations within a much larger planetary process. You start to see humanity not as separate from Earth, but as one of its many passing expressions, shaped by forces that existed long before any culture emerged. The Ganges Basin, once home to flourishing cities and empires, continues to evolve through slow erosion and gradual deposition of sediment. Landforms shift almost imperceptibly over centuries, reshaping valleys, plains, and riverbanks. You imagine the landscape breathing in geological time, expanding and contracting without urgency, interruption, or awareness of human timelines. Archaeological remains buried beneath layers of soil become silent witnesses to forgotten eras and forgotten decisions. Pottery shards, tools, and inscriptions rest in darkness, waiting for accidental discovery. You picture these artifacts as messages written to no one in particular, preserved only by chance, patience, and the indifferent continuity of natural processes. The concept of power itself begins to feel distant when viewed across such vast temporal scales of Earth history. What once seemed permanent now appears fragile, temporary, and constantly shifting through deep time. You begin to sense that authority, like water, always finds new paths when old channels disappear or become absorbed into changing landscapes, quietly reshaping itself without resistance across geological and historical transformations. Natural systems continue their cycles regardless of human presence, interruption, or historical significance across planetary time. Monsoons arrive, rivers shift course, and ecosystems adapt in continuous rhythmic transformation that never pauses or stops. You realize Earth does not wait for history. Instead, history unfolds within Earth's processes, shaped by forces far beyond human intention, planning, or control across vast environmental systems. Even memory becomes layered, fragmented and unstable when viewed through the lens of geological time and deep history. What is remembered depends entirely on what survives beneath the surface and what is later exposed through erosion or chance. You imagine history as a partially visible structure, where only fragments rise above the sediment of time, while most remains quietly buried, preserved without meaning until rediscovered. The idea of continuity becomes more important than any individual event or isolated moment in human history. Everything flows into everything else without clear separation or final boundaries. You begin to feel that existence itself is less about distinct moments and more about transitions, movements, and gradual transformations between states of being. In this deep stillness, sound becomes almost indistinguishable from silence as perception expands across geological scales. The river's echo, the wind's movement, and the earth's subtle shifts merge into a single continuous presence. You find yourself listening not for events, but for the continuity beneath them, the underlying rhythm that never stops. As geological time expands infinitely beyond human scales of meaning, even empires dissolve into patterns of change, deposition, and renewal. Nothing stands apart from this ongoing flow of transformation and accumulation. You begin to understand that permanence is only a temporary illusion created by limited perception within an endlessly changing system. And so in this final quiet awareness, everything returns to movement without end or fixed destination. The river continues, the earth continues, and time continues without needing direction, purpose, or conclusion. You remain within that continuity. where nothing begins and nothing ends, only gently unfolds across immeasurable time. The script comes to a close. Thank you all for listening.